This is a joint work with David Miller, who's at the board. The usual disclaimer applies. These are our own views. We're not going to talk about anything that is related to immediately current events, although if we have something to say about the inflation that we've had since COVID, probably that's efficiently find the past that I don't mean that had issues that this was working before. Sorry, I don't know what I did. Thank you. So the motivation for today's paper comes from two observations. So the first one is on the fiscal monetary side. We know at least since
La cosa está ahí, no aparece nada y no.
I take it I need a microphone. Is that no? Okay. We know at least since Sergeant Wallace, the deficits had a lot to do with historical high inflation episodes. Sergeant had a lot about pre-war Europe, but of course more recently there's been a lot of work on Latin America. And also, in Latin America, it's easy to make the point that fiscal imbalances threaten central bank independence. I think we had a very prominent example in the United Kingdom with a mini budget that the government and these trusts tried to pass and did not succeed in passing, where there was some immediate panic on government securities, and the Bank of England stepped in and reversed it. It wasn't a period in which it was reversing the purchases coming from the pandemic, and it immediately started buying again. And that shows you how fiscal imbalances can potentially spill over to central bank independence further. At the same time, if you actually look at the evidence between fiscal deficits and inflation, is way more mixed. So it's a little more prominent in Latin America. There's a recent book that Tim Keogh and Juan Panicolini edited, looking at the various experience of most large Latin American countries. But if you actually look across OECD countries, I wrote a paper after the 2008 recession where I wanted to, I was, I guess, testing the hypothesis that my prior was that all large deficits episodes were associated with inflations. It turned out not to be true, actually. If you look at it, there's plenty of examples. There's, of course, Japan, but there are other examples like Germany and after the reunification, some banking crisis in Scandinavia. And so there are many cases in which large deficits don't seem to imply inflation. Another piece of this mixed evidence comes in a paper by Bernd Lustig and Jentekin. They're looking at the real return on debt exposed. So anticipated inflation would be a way of having a low return like we had in the last few years. And they find actually that, of course, that paper was published in 2012, so it doesn't include COVID, but up to that point, the relationship was very weak. Bianchi and Melosi have a sequence of papers studying regime changes where they argue that there is a clearer link, but sometimes these are identified somewhat indirect. for instance, if you think about the Volcker period and you look at why you detect a regime change there, it's not really because deficits changed. Yes, they did eventually in the second Reagan administration. So after 1984, early on, the main reason they identify a regime change is that monetary policy itself changed. And then they think, well, that means that fiscal policy was going to get their house in order. But that's kind of an expectation about the future with no evidence whatsoever. And in fact, Simon Wallace partly wrote their papers in response to the fact that there was no evidence that this was going to happen. There's more recent evidence for COVID, though, by Baron Bianchi, that the magnitude of the deficits ran by countries around the world is correlated with the amount of inflation that countries around the world had. So we're gonna have, so this is gonna be the stage for our model. We have in mind a situation in which in normal times, the central bank is independent and you're not gonna see much relation between fiscal policy and inflation, because fiscal policy is going to keep its house in order for some horizon, and the central bank will be able to successfully target inflation. But then there are times where crises are sufficiently big that fiscal policy just cannot take it anymore, and monetary policy is supposed to step in. And so then the question is going to be, if you know that this is kind of the world of how long can you go before the crisis, the anticipation of the crisis, spills over to inflation? That's one of the questions that we're after. So, in a nutshell, this comes from the American example. I'm going to show you probably this 40 minutes. This is going to be our input. So, it's going to be bigger in the model, but it's a long run. This shock is going to be a shock in government spending, and there's a large range over which this is the first level. In the long run, nothing happens, and then if the shock is big enough, now you start having the prices going up with government spending. So that's going to be the input. The output is going to be what happens before that long run is realized. When and how that inflation is going to be realized. That's the question. And that ties with the second observation that we are going to be working from. This is a separate literature on government debt as an information insensitive asset. And so the idea is, in particular, Gary Gorton and Guillermo Ordóñez have push this line that there are assets that are information sensitive, the government debt, but they also have in mind mortgage-backed securities, not those guaranteed by the government, just those that were created before the 2008 crisis. And the idea is, in normal times, people have very little incentive to acquire information. And then these three things are going to be easily tradable, liquid, and nobody will have much of an incentive to find out what happens. But once you get closer to a crisis, then people are going to start having an incentive to find out what happens. And that will change the nature of the pricing process for these assets. And the big pricing process for the government bonds assets, that's what we're interested in, is going to be inflation. Now, just as it can be, so what is going to trigger this information acquisition can be just a gradual acquisition of bad news. But also, if you're just going to announce, and then back to the Liz Truss example, I'm going to lower taxes, I couldn't care less about a fiscal responsibility, that will have an immediate impact because people will pay attention to it. I'm going to let you decide whether the the various plans passed in early 2021 would fit or would not fit. Yeah.
So can I understand, for instance, the introduction of fiscal group, some risk like this information?
That would be, good fiscal news, and you'd think that that would have a potentially an important effect in that direction. Well, now we are seeing with Germany the reverse. So I guess it's Germany is probably sufficiently far from being in this area that it's not having a big effect. Okay. Yeah.
Clarification question in the previous graph. So this is at the margin of having a negative shock. What's the inflationary pressure? So
Okay, so this is going to be an important part of our story. Is risk is going to be asymmetric. As I'll show you that that's a key ingredient. So we are assuming that, but that's going to have some important implications down the road. We have the view that if fiscal policy is keeping the house in order, the central bank will be able to prevent deflation one way or another. Now, if you push me separately to talk about exactly how you're going to get out of a zero lower bound episode, I'm going to have to argue that at the end of the day, you need help from fiscal policy too. And so that's a separate, but that's sort of a very different type of fiscal policy. As typically, at the zero lower bound, politicians are super happy, of course, running expansionary fiscal policy. So, and government solvency is not a major concern at that point. Yep. Mm-hmm.
there is a lot of money like around and it doesn't seem that hard to be able to sort of incorporate information because
Okay.
not a small firm that it's like government is about that. So
There's a lot of
that
there's a lot of information, but if you push me to ask for my prediction, so I spend my life doing this, and if you push me to ask for a prediction of the future surpluses of the US and how much of that is going to be paid with taxes, spending, inflation, I have a lot of uncertainty about that. So I can imagine that the random person on the street running their business selling pizzas or empanadas probably have better things to do in terms of thinking about inflation in ordinary times than the government. And then, of course, once you get to hyperinflation, you're in a completely different world. Well, we don't want to think of hyperinflations in this world, but we want to think that there's a point at which people start worrying and paying attention. But in the US, you look at the survey of professional forecasters, their long-run inflation expectations were essentially at 2%. Up until very recently, they were flat as a pancake. They were used sometimes in forecasting models if you wanted to have a nice long-term anchor without baking in your a constant. You could just put in the survey of consumer expectation, not the survey of professional forecasters, and that would do great. So here's a motivating picture from Google Trends in the United States. This captures the frequency of searches of inflation and various combinations of fiscal stuff. And you can see that all of these measures spike up in recent times. So that's going to be part of our story. That's more attention to these questions. You can see for some of them, particularly for inflation stimulus, you can see a lot of people there in 2008, but it was much less prominent. Of course, part of it is because inflation itself was less prominent. But okay, so what are we going to do? I'm going to give you sort of two models. I'm going to put them together. The first step is going to be having a model of exogenous information with these two regimes. So lower deficits, taxes react to fiscal needs, or high deficits. They don't. And so at low deficits, there's no relation between inflation and fiscals and the fiscal stance, but there is at high deficits. Now that model is going to be super simple, super intuitive, very easy to compute. The one thing it will predict the fact that at low deficits, you don't see a relation, deficits you do. It also will predict, unless you have some weird distribution assumptions, that the transition is going to be smooth. So you're going to have a gradual, yeah, a question?
Yes. Also, like a correlation between inflation and debt in different times. This correlation is higher.
So so those would be rolling regressions. I mean, the closest thing that I can tell you is, so the paper by Barra and Bianchi that I mentioned had ran it for, they actually had rolling regressions in their paper. So that's using cross-country variation. So we know that cross-country variation has its own issues, but they showed that COVID deficits were predictive of inflation. Pre-COVID deficits were not predictive of inflation.
So that show was also looks like a
This one?
like a time frame. It could be also the case that now in time there are much more information. I very also that we see people are more willing to go and look for this in the internet, whatever.
So I think this index is not supposed to have a trend. That's my understanding. By the way, I should have mentioned how I normalize it. I normalize everything by, so 100 is, so these are 12 months moving averages at monthly frequency. 100 is the highest point in the picture. That's how I normalized it. So if there were a time trend, of course, you would see a time trend here. But my understanding is that shouldn't be. So these things should be normalized by the fact that, of course, searches are growing over time. And I'm happy to stand corrected if you know better than me about Google Trends and I got that wrong. But that's my understanding. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. I'm trying to think. I don't think that Barra and Bianchi have that decomposition of the previous papers. I suspect somebody has tried that, but I don't have it on top of my head. I myself did not try that distinction. Okay, so I was saying under exogenous information, you're going to get a gradual ramp up, so you're not going to get a tipping point. Now, then we're going to bring in the endogenous information part. We're going to make the point. The low deficits, if you're down here, it's pointless to learn much about the stance of fiscal policy. Then nobody is going to pay attention. But if nobody pays attention, the response is going to be muted by the fact that nobody is paying attention. Once you get here, there's going to be a much bigger incentive to pay attention, and then things are going to respond. And now the important thing, I'm going to show you a course that we need to complementarity in the decision of people. And so, I mean, endogenous information by itself is a magnification, is something that magnifies the response, because whether it's a strategic complements or strategic substitutes, you're going to have more people acquiring information, the further out you are here, and therefore people responding more to fiscal news. But I'm going to show you a force that is present in one of our standard models that says that the value of that information is higher for me when everybody else has lost. And what that does is it introduces the possibility of that there will be jumps and possibly regions of multiple equilibrium. I guess jumps go along with the regions of multiple equilibrium unless you're kind of in the knife edge case. Yeah.
Might be related to this question. What are the channels by which higher deficit, like taking into consideration the information make inflation respond to deficit news? Is it like through the demand channel or is it something through the financial?
You can think of it as through the demand channel. So we're going to have the fiscal theory of the price level at work here. And I would argue that the fiscal theory is a version of the demand channel. I tend to think more in terms of there are too many dollars chasing too few goods, but that's sort of the same thing as a demand channel. Okay, so here's going to be the timing of the model. It's going to be a simple 3-period model. Period 1 is going to be boring. It's going to be just a baseline. Period 2 is where all the interesting stuff happens. And period 3 is the long run where all deficits are realized. It's sort of what I showed you in for the numerical example. Now, if I weren't only interested in the exogenous information model, I could write down a very simple competitive model. Then, the algebra is something that you would be able to do in a week at most. But there's a little bit more work to be done once you want to have endogenous information. In particular, one of the things that is important is I'm going to need to clearly state who's setting prices and who's setting quantities, as you will see, and who's learning, and from whom, and from what prices do and do not reveal. All these questions are going to come up. And a competitive model is not going to be terribly good for that because competitive model prices and quantities are jointly determined. It's not so clear. So I'm going to follow a paper by my colleague Leverholt. I'm going to simplify things a little bit. They have somebody setting prices, somebody setting wages, and somebody setting quantities. I'm going to bypass the firms. So I'm going to have producers that only use their own labor. So I don't need to get wages. Everything I say here could be carried over there, thinking about how whoever is in charge, say unions, set the wage. Okay. So that was kind of an alert for why you see at the end of the day, the model is going to look very familiar, but there will be some extra elements that will not. And that's now you know why they're there. So I'm going to have a continuum of families in 0, 1. And then within each family, there will be a continuum of entrepreneurs that are running these firms. So the entrepreneurs are indexed by the family I and their identity J. That also comes in 0, 1. So each one of these entrepreneurs produces their own variety and across families as well. A family has the entrepreneurs that are producing. It also has a shopper that goes out and buys all these varieties, and then they are aggregated and consumed at the family level. So the set of goods is indexed by the family producing K. I'm switching to K because I is the family that is going to buy the goods, and K is the family that is selling the goods, and the entrepreneur J. Here are preferences. There are our usual friend, Dixit Stiglitz, aggregated overall varieties. It's a 2-dimensional aggregator, nothing changes because of that. But so this is consumption of a 10T of the variety produced by entrepreneur of family K, entrepreneur J of family K, consumed by family I. So that's how we aggregate it. And then we have some utility that for most of the talk, I don't need even to specify. Actually, I think. There is one case that it comes up. I'll bring you when to specify, but otherwise not. I'm gonna make my life simple. I'm gonna assume linear discontinuity work. That's gonna simplify the algebra a lot. It's not essential for what I'm gonna be talking about. So government, the government is gonna be a machine here. I'm not gonna describe why the government behaves that way, like much of the literature of the fiscal theory of the past level. So the government is going to have some exogenous spending, which in a second I'll show you will only happen in the last period, although then we can talk about extensions. And then the government is has an aggregate spending requirement, and as usual, it's going to minimize the cost of delivering that. So it has the same its aggregator as the household, so the demand, the elasticity of demand, total demand from the private and the public is the same also. The usual math, constant markup will apply. When there isn't information heterogeneity, things are going to be, of course, a little more complicated once we have the information heterogeneity. Here's the government. So the government is going to start off period 0. So the 3 periods are period 0, 1, and 2. There will be a period 3. Oh, no, that's a mistake. It's period 1, 2, 3. Then later I'm going to add a period 0. So the government starts period 1 with B0 nominal liabilities. I'm going to abstract from long-term debt. It's not crucial for what I'm going to talk about, although if you wanted to go quantitative, you'd want to have that. I'm also going to abstract from money, so I'm going to make government bonds directly the numeraire. The fiscal theory is going to be heavily at work here. It's not, again, that part would be easy to fix and add money to the picture. I'm not going to have any spending, government spending period 1 and 2. Period 1 makes absolutely no difference because there's no uncertainty there. With period 2, I'll show you how extending that wouldn't change anything. All the uncertainty is loaded into the spending shock, period G3. And because of the linearity in leisure, actually it doesn't matter whether the shock is to spending or taxes. I'm going to have my shock in spending, and then I'm going to show you in a second how taxes are determined. For that, I need to go to the period by period description. So this is what happens in the period. So here's how the timing of this economy works within each period. So the first thing that is going to happen is monetary fiscal policy is going to be set. Periods 1 and 3, well, I'll tell you exactly how it's set. Then after that happens, the producers will have a choice to acquire information. That's in the endogenous information regime. It's exogenous, and they're going to get some signals, and that's it. And then they're going to choose their prices. Now that I have my Dixit-Stiglitz economy, I have a clear notion of who's setting prices. That's going to be the entrepreneurs, the firms, the shoppers. You have to see the prices, potentially learn from the prices. And after that, they choose the quantities of each variety, and then they allocate whatever is left to buying government bonds. Government bonds are the only asset here. Simplicity. Yeah. So because the government is a machine, it doesn't matter, right? I'm specifying a sequence of what the government is going to do. But I don't have a motive for why the government is moving one way or another. Sorry?
The government is not maximizing.
No, the government is a machine. Yeah, nothing. It's not maximizing. It's spending that exogenous process, that exogenous G3, and I'll tell you now how it's set in tax. So here's monetary fiscal policy. That's perfect time for your question. This is period 3. This is the long run. So the government is going to start with some amount of debt B2 in nominal terms. That's gonna come from the past, although as you see in a second, the past will be such that it's going to be equal to be zero, but that's not super important. We have this G3 shock realized, and then there's another shock that is realized, and these two shocks are non-independent. So there are two monetary fiscal regimes. So if you end up in regime F, let me start with regime M. If you're in regime M, then the government is going to set real taxes to respond 1-for-1 to government spending. So it's going to be G3 plus some amount. I'm going to define that amount to be B2 over P star 3. And I'm going to call P star 3 the price level target. Because as you can imagine, if your surplus in the final period is B2 over P star 3, and you start off with the B2 nominal units of that, you should see where the price level is going to be in equilibrium. And that's why I'm going to call that price target. And I have in mind this in the background, you know, if I had a much richer description of the model, that's where the central bank comes in and it's taking actions so that P star 3 happens. Because if you're at Cochrane, you're going to say, no, it's entirely fiscal policy is determining this, and you know, it's to and this is still the fiscal theory is still at work here, because at the end of the day, its primary surplus is driving this. But we understand that even in a world in which the central bank is targeting the prices, you need fiscal policy to do the right thing for that price to work. And this is why I'm thinking of this of regime N. I think we managed to get regime N past the talk. It was done. The other regime is something that we call regime F. In regime F, the government does not respond to G3. And of course, you know, we could have less extreme versions, but things here, you want them to keep it as clean as possible. So then the government is setting some amount exogenous T hat of taxes, and that's it. So the surplus is going to be T hat minus G3, and that's what's going to be available to repay bondholders. What about period 2? Backwards.
Sorry, but
Yeah.
just understand really to basically you have the four in practice. You feel the fixed amount that may not cover the whole amount of debt.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, well, what's important is that T hat is at least as big as G, because otherwise I'm in trouble. This is the final period, so you can't run a deficit in the final period. I'm going to make assumptions. Once I give you my numerical example, that will be embedded, because otherwise there's no equilibrium. But once I've done that, then it's fine. Then there will be a surplus in the terminal period. The question is how large, and that's what's going to drive the price level. So here's the period 2. So now period 2, you start with some nominal that you want. And now I need to specify, I guess I'm going to call it monetary policy. I need to specify nominal interest rate. For the algebra, I'm going to make it equal to 1 over beta. That is nice because that means that the price, in the absence of uncertainty, the price level will be constant. In the numerical example, I wanted to have numbers that looked so that we could, it's not quantitative calibration, but they're not crazy numbers. So I put in 1.02 over beta, so it's we're going to have a target of 2% inflation. And then it took a long time to debug the code because of that discrepancy. Okay, what about tax? So it's going to be fixed. That's an assumption. You could relax that. You could have a Taylor rule if you have a Taylor rule, what's going to happen is that there will be propagation of inflation. So right now, in this version, we're going to have a burst of inflation. Suppose we have bad news. There will be some inflation in period 2, but then between period 2 and period 3, expected inflation is still going to be well, modulo some complications from non-linearities, but it's still going to be 0. If you have the Taylor rule, then inflation propagates and gets distributed smoothly between periods 2. Other than that, everything that I say is going to work in the same way. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that nominal taxes in this period just pay interest on the debt, so that debt is constant. Now, in this version, there's no shock in period 2, so it doesn't really make a difference for you that. That we just change the amount of nominal debt that you have in period 3. Once I guess we have a little bit of time probably to talk on an extension to the shock here. Then what you do in terms of taxes responding to the shock will matter a little bit, but it would not change the basic structure of the problem. So here's where the meat is. That's where on the information side. So first, there's going to be some free signal that comes to everyone, because if there's no free signal, then how we're going to decide when to acquire further information. So the free signal is going to imply a posterior probability of being a regime F, the one in which inflation responds, we'll see, to the shock, pi. And there will be, in general, a whole posterior distribution of government spending, condition being a regime F. The math, it turns out, because I simplified my life, the only thing that matters is the posterior mean, GP3. The important assumption is these two are not independent. In fact, in the example that I gave you, there was an extreme force of a form of dependence, because there was a threshold. If the shock is big enough, you're in regime N. If the shock is small enough, you're in regime F. If it's small enough, you're in regime N. More generally here, I want to be more general because that's going to be handy for the next proposition. Doesn't have to be that clear, but I want to have this property, and that's going to be my assumption that on average, the surpluses that you're going to have in regime F are smaller than the surpluses that you're going to be in regime N. So remember, this is the surplus that you end up with in regime N, for sure. This T hat minus G3 without the tilde is what you're going to get in regime F. That's uncertain depending on G3. And this is the expectation. I want the expectation to be small. The realization in principle could be bigger. So it could be situations in which you have a smaller deficit, a bigger surplus, I guess, and you still are in regime F, but in general, may or may not be the case, but in expectation, that's my key assumption, which is regime F is a regime in which somehow fiscal policy is constrained, and it tends to be coming with bad shocks, not with good shocks. Under endogenous information, that's a stage at which now producers can learn more. They have the option of a utility cost K to observe the future, both the regime and the spending realization. I'm going to do the algebra for the case in which they observe things perfectly, that you don't need that. You could have the important thing is they just get a better signal. For tractability, it's also very convenient that it's a public signal, so everybody gets to observe the same thing. The algebra will be way worse if you have a private signal. Full disclosure. That may come up if I have time to talk about the 4-period extension. But of course, once you observe things perfectly, private or public, it doesn't matter if you're observing the same thing. So after all of this has taken place, the producers are gonna set the prices. Now, the shoppers get the free signal. I'm not giving them the option to learn, mostly because, as you see, once the producers learn, then the shoppers are gonna learn from the pricing. They see what the producers are setting, and out of that, they're gonna back out what the producers learn out of deficits, and then they're gonna use that to choose the quantities. Here, one is super boring. I already told you, we start off with the nominal debt is 0. We have a fixed nominal interest rate. Now, here, there's no question of Taylor rule or anything because it's the first period, so it's there are no shocks. And for the same reason, assuming this tax rule that implies constant nominal debt, doesn't matter. You can assume whatever you want. You're going to have some different amount of nominal debt, but it's not going to respond to anything because there's nothing to respond. There's going to be some prior by 0 about the probability of being a regime F, some prior of G3. But the only thing that you're going to get out of this is a baseline price level so that we can talk about inflation rather than prices in period 2. But other than that, it doesn't do much. Okay, so that's the environment. Let me get to the equilibrium. So I'm going to work backwards once again. So here's period 3. Period 3 is very straightforward. So what I need to do is look at the solution for the producer problem. So the first thing is we already observed that the government has a real surplus of B2 over P/3 here with the regime N. The households have B2 bonds to redeem. So in order for the households, of course, the households don't want to be left with unspent bonds because it's a final period. They can't spend more bonds than they have because we're not allowing them to. And so the equilibrium price level will have to be put into perspective. So let's see how we need to make sure that the producers are happy setting the price of P/3, and so that's the next step. So here's the marginal revenue in utility terms for producers. So a producer has a demand, so the capital that has been aggregate. So in the aggregate, the demand of the private sector and the public sector is C3 plus D3. Here's the elasticity of demand for the individual, which is the usual fixed fee demand. P3 is the price index. And then evaluating in utility terms, this is where things get handy in terms of the algebra, having a continuum of private entrepreneurs. If you have a continuum, the consumption of the household is now dictated by the individual entrepreneur. So the individual entrepreneur is treating this as a cost. And that's the individual price charged by the individual entrepreneur. So that's the margin utility. So I can convert it into utility terms. Of course, the demand is in dollar terms, so that's how it gets deflected by P3. This is the marginal cost of producing. So quantities that are going to be demanded at every price because the margin of this utility of labor is 1. And you put the two things together. The first order condition tells you that you're going to have the usual markup, it's markup. And normally there would be the disutility of labor, but the disutility of labor is 1. So that is the usual condition. It says the marginal rate of substitution between consumption and leisure is equal to the it's markup. Theta, of course, is bigger than 1. The shopper has a very simple problem. They're going to spend all of their money. And so this is a symmetric equilibrium, which everybody charges the same price. And all families consume the same amount, which is equal. What about regime F? Well, it's essentially the same thing. The only thing that is different is here, that was the surplus, and that the price level to be equal to P/3. Now the surplus is T hat minus G3, and so the price level is the ratio, again, that's the fiscal theory work, of B2 divided by the surplus. Because in a finite horizon economy, you'd better have something like the fiscal theory at work. Because money, nobody would hold money if the world ends. So the problem of the producers is exactly the same. So we give rise to the same equilibrium condition that pins down what consumption has to be. Well, the margin of consumption, once you give me new this consumption, everybody charges the same price. Okay, so now one step back, here too. So let me do first exogenous information. And the exogenous information, things are pretty simple. So the producer side is exactly the same as before. So it ends up just giving consumption in the same way as period 3. The extra thing that we need now is the Euler equation of the shoppers. So the shoppers now are going to carry bonds into period 3, which they were not, of course, in the final period, but now they have a choice. Do I consume today or do I consume tomorrow? And this is the optimality for that. So the marginal utility today is equal to beta times the marginal utility tomorrow times the real interest rate. What's the real interest rate? What's the nominal interest rate? And then expected inverse inflation. And so this is expected inverse inflation, P2 times this. So with probability 1 minus pi are in the M regime, then inflation is going to be P2 over P squared 3. With probability pi are in the F regime, now you need the expectation of G3 condition being a regime F. I guess I called this G3 before. And so that's how things are going to be determined. Now, I can plug in, I know what consumption is, which in my simple world is a constant. So that tells me that the inverse of the price level today is just the expectation of the inverse of the price level. That tells me what the price today is. Now, I made an assumption earlier that fiscal, the F regime is associated on average with the worst news about spending. So that was assumed that, well, the assumption technically wasn't so close enough that it's the same thing. So it's P2 is increasing in pi. And then what you get out of this expression, of algebra, is that the price level is more sensitive to news about spending, the greater the chance of being a regime N. That's not too surprising, because if you're in regime M, if you know for sure that you're in regime N, then well, the P2 is equal to 1 over P star 3, it doesn't extend to G3. That derivative is 0, the greater the chance that you're here, the greater the chance that G3 is going to happen. So signals under exogenous information is still true that signals of fiscal stress make the price level respond more to G3. But if you have a nice continuous distribution, what this does, it gives you a nice continuous distribution of inflation. I was able to take a second derivative. So everything here is super nice and smooth. You're not going to see big jumps. Although, quantitatively smooth, of course, can be as close to kinky as you want, but that points to the idea that maybe you're not going to see big structural breaks. Okay, so now I want to add the endogenous information component. So the now I'm working in figure 2 backwards. So the first thing going back, the last thing going backwards is the shoppers. So the shoppers, I told you that was the assumption, they get a free signal. So they have the same information as the producers that don't pay the cost. That implies that they can compute the optimal price that will be charged by the uninformed producers. They go out in the market, they see the prices. They see a price that is not the one that would be charged by the uninformed producers. They know that the producers acquired information and they will use that information. Now, here's there's a kind of a small technical thing to mention. I'm going to assume that nobody learns from measure zero set of agents. I think I'm going to defend that assumption, on realism grounds, and then I'm going to tell you why it's also important technique. So the idea is you have 1 million firms. If one firm like me, I decide suddenly to charge a higher price than everybody else, the complication would be that you might infer, oh, Marco actually is the only guy in the economy that went out and learned what's going on. Therefore, we're going to all learn everything from Marco. Far-fetched. More likely is Marco made a mistake. Marco had a high production cost today. Crazy. In fact, you could build in heterogeneous productivities into this, and algebra would become more involved, but things would work in the same way. So those are natural things to infer. Why is that important? Because what I want is when I'm making my individual decision to acquire information, I don't want to face the possibility, oh, if I acquire information, everybody is going to learn from me. It's not going to be an interesting problem if that's the case. So if I individually choose to learn information, I'm the only person that will know that information in the entire economy. Okay, I'm going to be looking at few strategy equilibria. I'm going to show you in a second that I have a strategic complementarity, so that will tend to give you few strategy equilibria. In the appendix to the paper, we have a discussion of what happens with mixed strategy equilibria. Normally, when you have complementarities, you end up with like two pure strategy equilibria and then unstable mixed strategy equilibrium in between. Things are a little more complicated here because we have, it's not purely a game between the producers and among themselves, but there are these shoppers that are learning. And so there's kind of a discontinuity. If no producer acquires information, the shoppers are not going to learn anything. But if a positive measure, however small, of producers acquire information, then the shoppers learn everything. That leads to potentially either there's no mixed strategy equilibrium, or there's some cases in which you can end up with a complementarity still one pure strategy equilibrium, one mixed strategy equilibrium outside of the region of pure strategy equilibrium. I'll show you that complication arises. That's something that we do numerically. It arises only when you have a really high intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So not something that you want to worry too much about. Like 15. Okay. So what happens, given that all this information about learning, what happens if the producers are fully informed? Well, if they're fully informed, the shoppers, they're fully informed. The shoppers are also fully informed because they learn from the producers. Then it's as if we are under exogenous information, but we know that pi is either 0, 1, and we know G3. If you do that, then you get that the price level today is equal to the price level tomorrow. That's where in that interest rate being equal to 1 or beta comes in handy. And so G3 is going to be completely sensitive to, P2 is going to be completely insensitive to the shock. If we know that we're going to be in a regime completely sensitive, which means that you get the idea if we're in a regime F. Okay. Now, the next question, well, oh, by the way, what if they don't learn? Well, if they choose not to learn, then we're in the same as under exogenous information because we have the same exogenous information. So what's left now is figuring out when is it optimal to acquire information. We know what the economy is going to look like under the two scenarios, but we don't know when a producer finds it in their interest to acquire information. So let me do first the simpler case. Suppose everybody else in the economy acquires information. Do I want to acquire information? That's a test to see whether acquiring information is an equilibrium. So I need to check incentive for the single producer. So suppose I'm a single producer, say, okay, everybody else is going to acquire information I want. I say, okay. Now, what I know is that the shoppers are going to be fully informed because they're going to learn from the prices of everybody else who acquire the information. Therefore, the equilibrium is going to feature the same marginal utility, including for my own family. I also know that the current price level is going to be equal to the future price level, but I don't know what the current price level is because I'm setting the price jointly with everybody else. If you do the math, here's going to be the optimal price that I'm going to be charging. And of course, because P2 is equal to P3, I could write it in terms of P2 or P3, it doesn't matter. Quick sanity check. If there is no uncertainty, so this is the expectation from the perspective of an individual entrepreneur that got the public signal like everybody else, but did not acquire any information. If there's no uncertainty, then this boils down to Pij2 equals P2. That's sanity check. So the equilibrium is indeed symmetric. There's nothing to learn. I'm going to set the same price as everybody else. But in general, there will be uncertainty. Otherwise, this is not an interesting paper. And then I'm going to charge some combination of expectations. I think it's more interpretable once we compute profits. Here are the profits in utility terms of the informed producers. It actually turns out in equilibrium profits are always going to be like that when everybody makes the same choice. The single uninformed producer is going to have this expression for profits. Now, it takes a couple of steps to show that that number is less than 1. It better be, because otherwise I would have made a mistake. If you have worse information, you have to make in expectation worse profits. The question is how much worse they have to be. And of course, the more uncertainty you have, the more Jensen's inequality is going to be at work, and the smaller this term is going to be. Notice, if you have no uncertainty, then this is P2 to the zeta times 1 minus zeta. That's P2 to the minus zeta times 1 minus zeta, as they should. Right. The more interesting part, of course, uncertainty is always the more uncertainty, the more the greater the value of information. The more interesting part is that this is particularly sensitive to the right hand risk. How do we see that? Well, zeta, we're taking an expectation of P2 raised to a power greater than 1. This is not greater than 1, but it's still greater than 0. And so it's overweighing, overall this stuff is overweighing realizations with high prices. There's some economics behind that. If I don't know what everybody else is going to do, what is the really bad scenario for me? The really bad scenario is that you will find out that deficits are going to be, surpluses are going to be small in the future. So there's going to be a lot of spending. You're going to charge high prices. I don't know that. I'm going to charge low prices. What happens is consumers are going to come to me in droves. I'm going to be producing a lot, but I'm producing a lot at a loss because I didn't know that actually the real value of the stuff I'm producing is much smaller. And then that's terrible. The flip side is not so bad. If you find out that the future price is going to be low and you set a low price, I'm going to set a high price. So I'm not going to sell very much because that will hurt my profits. but at least I'm making a good margin, right? Because my markup is going to be higher than yours. I'm not going to sell much. I should have charged a lower price, but you know, the worst case scenario is I make zero profits. There's no way to make losses that way. And that's why right tail is what is this new. Now I want to contrast with the other case. So that was so when everybody else acquires information, information is very valuable when it's about right tail. So the risk that matters is right tail risk. Well, I'm not going to go back to that picture, but remember that my application was predicated on the assumption that we had right tail risk and not left tail risk. So information is going to be very valuable in this case when everybody else acquires. Let me see the flip side. What happens when is it in equilibrium? So that equilibrium will tend, where everybody acquires information, will tend to particularly exist when you know it will be driven by right tail. What about the equilibrium which nobody acquires information? So again, now I need to check a unilateral division, but now this time, everybody else did not acquire information, I choose to acquire it. So complication from the previous case. In the previous case, it was simple because the shoppers were doing the right thing from my perspective. They had better information than me, so they were on the Euler equation. I was very happy with my family being on that Euler equation that was based on better information than mine. Now, this time, as an individual entrepreneur, I know something more than my shopper. And so if I could give my shopper a call and tell them, future prices are going to be high, buy today, don't sell. I would want to do that. I'm not allowed to do that by assumption. So that means that the envelope condition is going to fail. And it matters whether the shopper is going to consume the extra resources in period 2 or period 3. I'm making some extra profits compared to everybody else. Before I didn't have to take a stance. Now I do have to take a stance. Do they consume it in period 2 or period 3? You have two possibilities, two options. One is to say, actually, these extra profits shop at the end of the period, and so the shopper is only going to use them in period 3. I'm going to go that way for two reasons. One is it gives rise to simpler algebra. Two, it's the most conservative one. It's the least likely to produce multiple equilibria and complementarities. The alternative that you could use, I'm going to give you some economic intuition for that in a second. The alternative is to say, actually, no, they see it in period 2. They don't know where it's coming from. It might be a laziness shock on Marco's part that he's setting higher prices than everybody else. And it doesn't work. But then they're going to allocate it symmetrically to periods 2 and period 3 that you can work with. In fact, if we get to the 4th period extension, I will have to work with that because then there will be 2 periods of so on and so forth. To give you some intuition for why having the consumption happen in period 3 is conservative, let me focus on the polar case. What if all these resources were consumed in period 2? Now, there's no justification. That would not be an optimal choice for the shopper. There's no reason why they should do that. But to get ideas, what if they did that? Well, then there's always an equilibrium in which nobody acquires information. Why? Because these resources that I'm producing are getting consumed in period 2, and the price level in period 2 is because nobody else has the information about period 3, is independent of the stuff that I learned. So I learned something that's completely useless because my shopper is still going out and spending my profits at the price level P2, not P3. And then learning about P3 is completely irrelevant. Then it's always an equilibrium that nobody learns. That's the extreme version of strategic complementarity. If nobody learns, everybody is happy not learning. That's not the case when resources are consumed in period 3. Now, learning about period 3 is valuable. I think that's everything that I told you. So here's the choice from the perspective of the single import producer. It turns out that the optimal choice here, we remember that that comes in part from having the nominal interest rate equals 1 over beta. Otherwise, there would be a constant coming from the nominal interest rate. Rather than that, the optimal choice for me is to set my price in period 2 equals to the aggregate price level in period 3. And once you do that, here are the profits. These are the profits of the uninformed producers that are actually the same. So here, actually, learning is a zero-sum game, which is not surprising if you think about it, because at the end of the day, somebody has to pay for government spending. So we all spend these resources potentially trying to learn something. We're stuck paying for it, and there's no gain. So if we collectively could agree to ignore that, we'd be happy. Except that if you do that, and there's enough uncertainty, that's what we're doing exactly now. I can do better than all of you, and that's how things are done. The profits of the single informed producer, of course, in expected value now are bigger. And so now, of course, with these, we need to see whether they're compensated by the factor K, but other than that, they are bigger. And now the important thing is you see all these expectations are now raised to a negative value. So it's left at risk that matters. Economic intuition is exactly the mirror image of before. That's what you would expect. When is it really valuable? Information is really valuable in this case if I find out that the future price level is going to be low. Because now I can charge a lower price than all of you. I can undercut you. I'm going to sell a ton, but now I'm selling a ton of a profit because this stuff is going to be, these profits are going to be really valuable next period. If I find out that the future price is going to be really high, the best thing that I can do is set a high price. Nobody's going to buy from me, and I'm going to make zero profits. And so our environment doesn't have a risk. So left a risk. So what happens in the end is the uncertainty threshold for which this equilibrium exists. Sorry, yes, it's the information threshold. So there's for which, when this equilibrium starts to exist, happens at a higher level of uncertainty than the I'm getting mixed up. I come back in the picture. I think you see what I'm saying. Given that information is more valuable when everybody else acquires it, there's a region in which if you acquire it, I want to acquire it. If you don't acquire it, it's less valuable. I don't want to acquire it. And so that's how this is going to go. So there's going to be, in general, 3 regions. In general cases, you have one, 2 we don't exist. There's going to be a region first where the probability of being in the fiscal regime is sufficiently low that there's never an equilibrium with information acquisition. Even if all of you choose to acquire information, I would still find it not useful to acquire information. And then you'll get very little response to fiscal news. As things start becoming bleaker, then you're going to enter into a region of multiple equilibria. And at that point, I can't tell you exactly what's going to happen, but you will, in general, see jumps from one regime to the other. Exactly where that happens is we don't know. And that also should make policymakers somewhat nervous because we're not going to have a clear signal here of when we're about to cross that threshold. And then, if uncertainty is sufficiently big, if you know that the government is broke, then essentially there's only the informed equilibrium that survives, and everybody is going to pay a lot of attention, and then inflation is going to track deficits growth. Period 1 is the same thing, so it's very boring. You're going to get a baseline price level that depends on the prior. There's nothing to learn because all the learning happens in period 2. And so the other thing that it gives me some price level to compute inflation. There's nothing else to talk about. Let me give you a numerical example to fix this. So I'm going to have normal shocks to G3 properly truncated so that we don't run into issues about negative deficits. I'm also going to have a normal signal. And actually the truncation is going to be, the variance of is going to be sufficiently small that we're not going to need to worry about the truncation. I don't know, take care of that. It was completely irrelevant. So as I told you in this numerical example, the two regimes are directly triggered directly by the spending. So there's a maximum tax rate T bar. You cannot go above T bar. If T bar is enough, then you're just gonna set taxes so as to ensure that the price level is actually 1 in the example. This picture you can see. If T bar is not enough to keep the price level at 1, then you're going to have inflation tracking. The price level tracking spending. Inflation between period 1 and 3 tracking spending, and then we need to talk about period 2. So here's the version, and no information acquisition. So if it's infinitely cost to acquire information, very simple. It's just a smooth version of what you have seen. We're down here. Everybody knows that there will be no response. So this was responding to the realization of government spending. This is responding to the posterior mean of government spending. It doesn't matter. Inflation is always going to be 2%. I set now the interest rate so that inflation is 2%. If there's no problem, actually slightly less than 2%, because it has to be the inverse inflation has to be inverse of 2%. So you're going to be slightly under the inflation target because you have to make up that inflation. Yep. It's P2 over P1, the minus 1 in this picture. So the prior doesn't matter for this. Yeah. Because, I brought in, you have some prior, so I have my, the Fisher equations on work here. These are flexible price model. So I tell you the nominal interest rate is 1.02 over beta. Then what happens, inflation without uncertainty would have to be exactly equal to 2%. Here it has to be properly said is inverse inflation, but forget about the Jensen inequality for a second. Expected inflation has to be 2%. And that's what pins down this picture. So you're undershooting a little bit. If you're if you get a good realization, you're overshooting if you get a bad realization. By the way, from the fact that we're very close to 2%, you can see that I set my quantity so that most of the probability mass is here. I want to think about US, Europe, and so on, and that's where it comes from. So I don't have on the slides the targets, but I targeted some probabilities of hitting 6% inflation or another values of inflation. Probably is some more. Most of the mass is down. Okay, so this is the picture that shows you the cost and benefits of acquiring information. So blue line is costs of not acquiring information when everybody else acquires it. Orange is benefits of acquiring information when nobody else acquires it. The threshold is here is a 6%, 0.6% of profits. That's the cost of the signal in this calibration. So this is in percentage. So 0.06 is when you get the threshold. These lines look identical, but they're not. They're very similar, but not quite identical. And that's why you get a region of multiple equilibria right there. So the first line to cross the magic 0.06 threshold, 0.006 threshold is the blue line. Once you hit that point, there is an equilibrium in which everybody acquires information. Once you hit the second dotted line, the only equilibrium has everybody acquired information. Here's what inflation looks like in this economy when you have endogenous information. So the red line is what we've seen before. Once you enter into the gray area, and I don't know what's going to happen. You could remain with the red line, or you could go to information acquisition. If you go to information acquisition, then the posterior mean of government spending is irrelevant. What's relevant is the actual realization of government spending, because people will learn it. And that's why I drew 3 lines. The 3 lines are there also to remind you that on average, you can't have just a jump up. So you're going to get a jump up in inflation if there are bad news that trigger information acquisition, and actually there is really truly a bad situation. Yeah. So the x-axis is
1% of spending over the GDP.
this is you know, I didn't normalize it by GDP, so you don't want to interpret it that way.
What is the one?
One is just you want to think of it. So the way I calibrated the model was A hit 1 as just a normalization for the price level, and then it's mostly the calibration is about the variance of the shock and the variance of the sigma, and I use those to calibrate the probability of hitting. I remember one is 6%, and I forgot what the other cutoff was. So if you go back, anyone wants to check the paper, you'll find out. So 1 doesn't mean much here. The only thing that you want to keep in mind is the probability of being out here is pretty low. And on top of it, the probability of being out here, so this is the posterior mean. So after you got the signal, and then the posterior mean, condition of being getting a posterior mean here that triggers information acquisition. You also need the inflation to actually happen. You need that there's truly a fiscal problem. The model delivers inflation scares. That's how I want to call them, in which people start becoming worried. They become informed. They find out actually things are not so bad, and then inflation is going to be lower than it would be if they didn't apply inflation. But yeah, it's a feature of the model. Once you have this endogenous information channel, you will have information scares where things drop down. Okay, I have 10 minutes. Then I'll give you a flavor of some extensions. So first extension, relatively straightforward. I'm not gonna even work that much on it. What if I have a spending shock in period 2 as well? Well, what matters really is in period 2 is the present value, the expected present value of surpluses. That's what it is. So if G2 moves around and G2 does not move around, that will have a similar effect to bad news about G3, because it's essentially the same thing as bad news about G3, particularly because I have linear practices measure, so it doesn't matter whether I have to produce a one or 2. So everything that I told you about news about G3 is going to carry over to actual realizations. And so that, maybe it's more closely related. So the news is Liz Truss. COVID looks more like a G2 shock, where G2 here could also be in principle transfers. So it could be some having it on G2. I could also have it on T2. So tax is going down. That would also have a similar effect. everything I said. So you're gonna get more response to deficits when they're bigger in period 2, and with endogenous information, you're gonna have this strategic complementarity, so you can have a discrete jump. All of that is going on. What about adding more periods? So now we're gonna go numerical because things get complicated. So now I told you before periods were 1, 2, and 3. I'm gonna add period 0. Why am I adding in front? Because it's convenient, because now periods 2 and 3 are gonna remain exactly as they were before. All the analysis I've done, I'm gonna be based off of the numerical example, other than the fact I'm gonna cut in half the precision of the information of the free signal, because now you're gonna get 2 free signals, one in period 1 and one in period 2. But in terms of algebra, nothing changes. And now I need to add this extra period, which you can potentially learn. So things are new. So in period 2, I'm going to retain the assumption that endogenous learning is perfect. In period 1, I cannot make the assumption that endogenous information is perfect, because otherwise there's nothing to learn in period 2. That's why I'm going numerical, because now things are going to be more complicated. So now you will get some free signal, and you will also get a costly but noisy signal, which is going to be powerful. So the same for everybody that chooses to acquire information. So here's the additional complication that arises in the period approach. Now, suppose all of you choose to acquire information and decide, actually, no, I'm not going to acquire information. That means for today, it's the same problem that we had in period 2. But at the end of period 1, I get to see the aggregate price level in period 1. So I learn all of the information that you learn, I also learn at the end of period 1. So when we start period 2, we're all alike again. So it's kind of a one period game. Whereas if we do the flip side, none of you acquire information, and I choose to acquire it, have that information. It's valuable in period 1. It's also valuable in period 2. I enter period 2 and I know something that you don't. And so the bottom line is there's a potential incentive to free ride on the information of everybody else, because part of the value that if information spills over to me, I learn it at the end of period 1. And now there's also an interesting aspect in terms of, so this is both in the aggregate and then the individual level, but think about the aggregate. Suppose agents acquire information in period 1. Are they more or less likely to acquire information in period 2? Well, there are two countervailing forces. If we acquire the information in period 1, we have better information. So if we already have better information, learning more is less valuable. That makes us less likely to want to invest in acquiring information. On the other hand, why did we choose to learn in period 1? We chose to learn in period 1 because news were bad. But if news are bad, we are more likely to want to acquire information again. So that's that trade-off. So when you have the bad news effect dominating, what you're going to see is that with bad news, you're going to get information in period 1, but then you're also going to get information in period 2. And so this is a mechanism that triggers not just high inflation, but also volatile inflation. So high inflation and volatile inflation go together here, because once you enter into this regime, people keep worrying about deficits, and they want to keep learning. And so this is what this picture shows you. This is so suppose news in period 1 were sufficiently bad that we chose to acquire information in equilibrium. There's going to be some inflation realized, and I told you there's the possibility of inflation spares, so you're going to be potentially down here. This is sort of capped because of the way the model is driven. Well, it's not capped here, it's capped on level below %. And the worse the news that we got, the higher we are. Now, most of the time we're gonna be down here. Now, up there, as I told you, the probability of 20% inflation is very low under my calculation, but what you can see is if we get an inflation scale, then we're solving that the things are gonna remain constant in period 2. It's very, very, very unlikely, much more unlikely than otherwise that we will acquire information, because we found out that things are really fine, and then it takes a huge signal to change our mind. But if we found out in period 1 that things are bad, and we got high inflation because of it, now we're really worried. Now we know that, fiscal deficits are going to be driving inflation. Then we want to know, so in period 2, we have the opportunity to learn more. We're going to take that opportunity with very high probability. And so that's going to trigger a permanent. So once you get an information-driven inflation in period 1, if it's high, then you're going to get very likely continued information acquisition and continued volatility. There are some other things that you can think about for other sources of complementarities that we didn't model, but I think are there in the model and not model in reality that you can think that will strengthen our results. One is complementarities in information production. So if I suddenly start caring, and you were saying about fiscal deficits, newspapers are going to carry many more articles about that. It's going to be easier to learn, and therefore the cost of acquiring that extra information is going to go down. That would be another complementarity channel. Another complementarity channel that is not in my model is going back to the Gorton and Modogna story. So if you think that that is more liquid when there is no information acquisition, because I'm not worried that you're trading with me because you know something that I don't, then the interest rate will tend to be lower. And so that is going to be more sustainable. Once we trigger information acquisition, all this volatility in information acquisition might disrupt that liquidity, will lead to higher interest rates. Higher interest rates are going to make the debt problem worse and might reinforce might create a negative feedback loop and get more and more inflation. So those are forces that you could add, would magnify the region of multiple equilibrium. So the bottom line is what I showed you today is a model where there's not much happening to inflation over a large range, potentially a large range, but at some point things snap. You hit a fiscal limit and suddenly inflation appears, and people want to learn more. There's going to be more volatility. The bottom line is just because you sent $800 checks and nothing happened, it might not be a good idea to try and send $2,000 checks and expect that nothing is going to happen.
I know the government so although you know the shocks to G, but you have more periods and you can roll over that for you, right? Yeah. And you acquire information for like 1 2 periods, but then you can roll over that in the case of actually a crisis. And when you roll over that, there's information about that too. I mean, it doesn't matter because then the price will not adjust, replace that,
Okay. So this is not a model of default. That's important. So you're right that there is one force that work a little bit in the direction that you mentioned, so that if inflation jumps and I don't touch taxes, then what will happen? That will help a little bit on the sustainability front. So that will reduce that a little bit. That will be incorporated in the decisions of these people. That will make inflation jump less in the future. In fact, to some extent, that is here because so inflation jumps. So let me go here. What happens here? Inflation, let's see, things are bad. Inflation jumps in period 2. What's inflation between period 2 and period 3? 2%. we're done. We've already washed away the debt, and there's nothing else that is happening. That in order, and that also is going to be true. So the 4-period model, if I don't have a Taylor rule, I'm going to have high inflation in period 1 going with volatility in period 2, but not with high inflation in period 2, because expected inflation is still going to be 2%. More precisely, expected inverse inflation. Yeah. Now, because this is a kind of, I hesitate to call it a flexible price model. In one dimension, it's flexible because prices are set period by period. But there is a stickiness aspect to it that comes from the fact that I'm charging the price. I don't get to revise my price after I see your price. So in that sense, it's sticky. We all choose the price at the same time, and then we don't get the price. But across periods is flexible, and so the Fisher equation is our work for you. The only thing that drives inflation is nominal interest rates. As central banks, we don't think that just raising inflation, the only thing that raising interest rates is doing is raising inflation. So otherwise, we would be running policy in a very different way. Then you can layer on complications. So, all the usual things about the new Keynesian model are going to come into play. You're going to have everything that I said about inflation here would carry over in terms of spilling over from inflation to a boom, an economic boom, and then persistent inflation down the line. So all of that you can add to your model. And also another thing that is important in terms of thinking about persistent inflation that is missing here is long-term debt. Because that's, if you have long-term debt, even in a flexible price model, this inflation doesn't need to happen all at once, because I can devalue long-term debt by inflation today or inflation tomorrow.
Yeah, like foreign debt that's not denominated in local currency. Other currencies, so you don't have to pay.
Okay. So if you have both domestic and foreign currency debt, then this problem is going to be bigger because the only thing that you can wash away is the domestic. If you have lots of foreign currency debt or all of the foreign currency debt, then you start thinking about default risk and non-inflation risk. So this is a paper strictly about inflation. That allows me to give some advertisement for another paper with Carlo Galli, which is also a paper about fiscal policy and inflation or default risk, and where not endogenous information, where information plays a very important role. But there, it's heterogeneous information. So here, there's the endogenous choice, high or low. Then you have some people with high information, which we call the bondholders, and some people with bad information. We call them the producers. So they're the ones setting the prices. And so when you have lots of default risk, things are driven by the sophisticated agents, the bondholders, because if I'm a holder of a bond today in a world in which there's a lot of default risk, my worry is that will there be somebody that is willing to buy the bond and roll over the debt? If I'm in a world in which you have domestic currency debt, default risk is less of an issue. I'm more worried about inflation because, worst case scenario, March 2020 happens. These are strongly my views and not anybody else's views. And then there will be a large player come in saying there's lots of technical complications why people don't want government debt. And so that's always an option. Then default is not a problem, but then inflation is a potential problem. Thank you.